It's not just that Seinfeld was a weird show. It was a weird show that was also the most popular sitcom in the United States. People tuned in, week out to watch Jerry and friends ponder the minutiae of life, but also ponder some weird dark stuff that you wouldn't expect in a show that gets so mainstream popular. Like serial killers, for example. There are multiple episodes of Seinfeld where the plot hinges around the existence of serial killers, and that is just not something other major sitcoms do. They don't do it once, much less multiple times. I've been thinking about Seinfeld a lot lately because my podcast, Gayest Episode Ever, did a history of the show implying that George Costanza is on some level not heterosexual. It actually happens a lot, certainly more often to George than the show does to the other three leads, and I rewatched the entire series to be able to document every instance of it. If you want to listen to that episode of my podcast, which is in general about LGBTQ episodes of classic sitcoms, there's a link in the show notes. But today I want to talk about a weird through line that exists in Seinfeld involving addiction and Cashmere. Now, if you're a fan of the show, you probably heard addiction and Cashmere and immediately thought of the first episode to link these two things. Season 3's The Red Dot, written by series co-creator Larry David. This is the one where Elaine gets George a job at Pendant Publishing, and as a thank you, George gives Elaine a cashmere sweater, which he bought cheap because it has a minor flaw on it.
See this red dot?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's damaged.
Well, it's not really damaged. Wow, $85, huh?
Mm-hmm. There's no exchanges on this.
Of course, Elaine realizes and gives the sweater back to George, and because George is George, he later tries to re-gift the sweater to the office cleaning lady with whom he has begun an affair. She has, let's say, an extreme reaction to Cashmere.
Oh, but I grabbed onto his leg, screaming for him to give me the sweater, and he dragged me through the streets. And then he kicked me with the other foot, and he threw some change at me. But I didn't want the change, Georgie. I wanted the cashmere.
Meanwhile, Elaine's plotline is all about dating Dick, a recovering alcoholic who falls off the wagon. It's kind of Jerry's fault, and the episode ends with Dick on a drunken rampage, coming back to the Pendant Publishing office and looking for revenge. Jerry, George, and Elaine hide from him, and then they try to appease him with the sweater, which goes about as well as you might guess.
Is that cashmere?
Of course it's cashmere.
What's this?
That's a pretty notable collision of addiction and Cashmere in one episode. It's the kind of thing that later writers would remember, you'd expect. And especially given how big Seinfeld was on building a cumulative universe, where supporting characters come back and certain ideas are revisited again and again, you think it might be something that was returned to purposefully. Well, Seinfeld did return to it, though to this day I'm not sure if it did so intentionally. Moving ahead in the Seinfeld chronology, the next episode that fits in this pattern is season 5's The Sniffing Accountant. But we're going to put a pin in this one for a second because it's a little weird. Instead, we're going to go all the way to season 9, to the episode The Apology, written by Jennifer Crittenden. This is the one where James Spader guests as Jason Stanky Hanky, who's going through Alcoholics Anonymous, and he's at step 9, which has him apologizing for all his misdeeds. George is stoked because he's expecting an I'm sorry for an incident related to, you guessed it, a cashmere sweater.
So in front of the whole party, he says, "No, I don't want you stretching out the neck hole."
It's not a major plot point, not really, but in light of the Red Dot episode, it's interesting that this sweater is specified as being cashmere. Sure, a cashmere sweater is expensive, and that's reason enough for this guy not to want George's big melon head ruining his, but let's skip ahead to the next episode, also from season 9, written by Spike Ferenston. This is the one that is mostly about George being forced to buy a book because he took it into the Brentanos' bathroom. Elaine's plot, however, is about faking a relationship with a male coworker to cover for the fact that she got hammered at an office party and made out with him. Elaine intends just to break up with the guy, but that's when J. Peterman informs her that Zach is addicted to opium and Elaine must help him through withdrawals. She does, because her job depends on it, and it's a messy process.
I told you, away from the curtains. Away! Use your bucket. There you go, that's it.
Towards the end of the episode, just when you think Seinfeld has allowed a whole plotline about addiction to slip by without a mention of Cashmere, Jerry and Elaine return to Brentanos.
So this book will tell me how to get puke out of Cashmere?
Yeah.
There you go. It's not a sweater explicitly, but it is a reference to Cashmere, and it almost feels like the show being like, oh shoot, this is wrapping up. We need to get a reference to Cashmere in here before the episode ends because it's some weird rule that all of our addiction episodes have to mention Cashmere. Or something. That might seem like a stretch, but the Bookstore is an interesting episode in terms of callbacks because it makes a few of them. The whole reason Elaine gets drunk and makes out with her coworker, for example, is because she's stressed about embarrassing herself because the previous year's office party is the one where she did her infamous little kickstance. The episode is also the second to feature a recurring character named Rebecca De Mornay, who does not look like the famous person who is also named Rebecca De Mornay. Obviously, Spike Feresten understands the history of the show and is down to reference things that happened before. That's the direction that Seinfeld leaned more and more in its later years. And because this episode seems to fold back on itself in these different ways, I'm inclined to read this throwaway reference to Cashmere as another callback.
You get your toilet book out of here, and I won't jump over this counter and punch you in the brain.
Now, let's go back to the Sniffing Accountant, which sort of fits the pattern but is tweaked in ways that make it different. This episode, written by Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, is the one where Jerry suspects that his accountant may be on drugs because he has a peculiar sniffle. Separately, he gives a new mohair sweater to Kramer because it's too itchy. What is mohair? It's similar to cashmere, which is a wool made from certain breeds of goats. Mohair is made from the hair of the Angora goat, which is apparently different from Angora wool, which is apparently made from rabbits. Differences aside, the show treats them the way most people would treat them, as high-end fabrics that are basically interchangeable without getting too caught up in the technical differences. So as this episode goes on, Jerry becomes convinced that Barry the accountant must be on drugs and writes a letter firing him and then gives it to Newman to be delivered. But then a pizza delivery guy comes to Jerry's apartment and starts sniffling like Barry does, and the guy explains that he is allergic to mohair. So Jerry now thinks it was all a mistake and he shouldn't fire Barry. Meanwhile, there is this whole other fabric-related through line in this episode, where people are touching the fabric on each other's clothes, and it's either a romantic gesture or an offensive one, depending on who's doing it and what the context is. Elaine, for example, ends up dating Jake Jarmel because he did this to her. When George tries this on a woman, it does not go well at all. Newman tries it too, and again, it is unwelcome to the point that he runs away in terror, dropping Jerry's letter. At the end of the episode, Jerry finds out that Barry really was on drugs and in fact went into bankruptcy as a result. Jerry would have gotten his money back if Newman had mailed the letter, but just before he can get angry at Newman, a woman comes by and fingers the material on Jerry's jacket, and Jerry gets distracted. What do we make of this? It is notable that of the 4 episodes I'm talking about, this one has the most interest in fabric, and that it comes up a few different times in a few different ways, including a lengthy description by George of the first time he saw a bra. However, if it's so focused on clothing material, it's weird that it would get the important one wrong. Mohair instead of cashmere. If it had just been cashmere, it would fit perfectly, but as is, it just almost fits, which for someone like me is kind of tantalizing. It's worth pointing out that this particular plot came from Jerry Seinfeld's real life, where he really did lose $50,000 to an accountant who spent it all on cocaine. Given that the writing credit is shared by Jerry and Larry David, it's entirely possible that the mohair sweater storyline is David attempting to call back his own red dot storyline, and then for whatever reason cashmere got swished out with mohair, we don't know why. You're probably wondering at this point why I just didn't ask the writers. I did. I tweeted the question at Jennifer Crittenden, who still maintains a Twitter account but who doesn't post a whole lot. Way back when, I did ask Spike Feresten about how the Rebecca De Mornay character got her name. He said it was just a non sequitur, but he's since deleted his Twitter account. I did message him via Instagram, but it's less often a place where moderately famous people respond to randos, I found. I did not ask Jerry Seinfeld or Larry David because I did not feel like they would be likely to answer, even though I did technically meet Larry David in a men's room once, and that is neither here nor there. So what we're left with is this weird, rather specific pattern going through the run of Seinfeld, and with no one who works for the show weighing in and saying, yeah, it's totally something we're aware of and totally something we did on purpose, we kind of have to include that it's all just a big weird coincidence. But even that is kind of interesting, I think, because you get a bunch of literate, word-minded people working together on a show that's big on referencing itself, and somehow no one realized they were making this weird linkage between addiction and cashmere that's begging for over-analytical nerds like me to read something into it. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but clearly it exists either way. If this deep dive into niche Seinfeld history makes you want to hear more about sitcoms, I would humbly suggest you check out Gayest Episode Ever, where we have more than 200 episodes, and at this point, we've probably covered your favorite sitcom. If you want to see our supercut of every time the show referenced George being gay, that lives on our Patreon, patreon.com/gayestepisodeever, but the video is open to anyone who wants to watch, and there's a link specifically to that in the show notes as well. Finally, do you have a pet observation about Seinfeld you'd want explored in a future video? Is there a weird hidden through line for this series that's even odder than the addiction cashmere thing? Let us know, because apparently we make videos about this kind of stuff.
Mr. Marbles?